Alright, what is up, PvE family? It's your boy PvE Git Gud back at it again with another video. Today, I welcome you back to the second part of Git Good 101, the series where I, try to explain things, be a little bit more educational than normal, so that, if you're watching this, you can improve at the game if that's something you are looking to do. So today we're going to be talking about the playing. I have three of the big concepts I want to talk about are, deck building, which I've already done, playing and testing. It's going to be the section on playing. And, a lot of improvement will come from, paying attention to detail and knowing what your opponent's deck does as well as yours, or at least have a good enough game sense that you can understand what someone's deck does as it progresses if you don't initially know what it does, right? So obviously one needs to be able to play well to do well, right? But playing better is just, it's not as simple as just playing more or testing more or just playing more in general. That's not really, I guess, good enough. You have to have the right approach, the right mentality. But yeah, testing again is the last like big topic video. So talking about playing, first and foremost, and maybe the most obvious of the points is that you really have to understand what your deck does. Um, you have to understand every card that you put in the deck. Every card gets put in the deck for a reason. We joke a lot about GPS players. Oh, we're not able to read. Oh, we don't do this and that. Um, but we can read cards once in a while, right? We wouldn't put a card into our deck without knowing what it does. But I think, right? Hopefully, no one's putting in cards just because what other people are playing, or they just net deck without understanding. That's something you really don't want to be doing. Um, you want to understand how your deck plays into other things. You want to know what your matchups are, based on what your current deck build is. But most importantly, in terms of understanding your deck, you want to know what sort of curve your deck has, right? This is maybe not the best deck to put that example with, but what do I mean when I say curve? So curve means that your deck will normally want to try to do certain things on certain turns. Um, Nowadays, it can even matter on whether you go first or second. We are getting more cards nowadays that say if you have or if your opponent has X amount of energy. So, your deck is, and they do this with archetypes a lot now. If you have certain condition that you're gonna hit at whatever turn, unless your deck is like completely generic, much like this one, which is why it's not a great example. There's always something your deck is or should be looking to do on every turn. Even this deck, you've got cards like, let's say, let me find it first. Like this Oob says, oh, if your opponent has two more energy, okay, so I know that I can start playing this card on turn two, and a lot of times I will want to, but most of the cards in this deck are like, I just play them whenever. There's a certain condition to fulfill, but I can play them whenever. So this deck specifically, not many decks are like this. I'll say that right now, where you have like completely way over what you are doing. Most of the decks will have cards like that Oob, where they're like, oh, if like I said earlier, if your opponent has a certain amount of energy. But yeah, I want to reiterate how important this is, because it is important for you to know what your opponent does. I think almost equally as important as what your deck does. But obviously, you can't really begin to test properly, tweak your deck properly, or play properly if you don't really understand what your deck is doing. So, well, I do think that playing is like the least important of the three concepts I talked about. Um, I obviously you have to have a baseline, right? So you have to understand what your own deck does before you go and do anything else. I just think that that is the easiest part, I guess, out of everything you can be doing. Um, think of like helping yourself before others, except you're helping yourself before you go and kill someone else. Um, but it's that sort of mentality. You have to understand yourself before something else. Knowing how your deck plays and more importantly can play in any given turn, depending on what your hand is and what you draw, will really help you grasp the basics of how to play and give you a good foundation of how to improve from that base, and how to start being able to improve. The next concept I want to talk about is just really simple, basically just a glorified way of saying read your cards, but detail. You need to understand what cards do exactly. Like I talked about in deck building, how you should be reading your leader before you build your deck. It's the same concept here. Just make sure you read your cards to the molecular freaking level, because I built this recently. I built this Gohan deck recently, and I'm still like, I make this mistake too. I don't just read every card when I play because maybe I won't use it or whatever, and then I get caught in moments where I'm like, oh, you can't do that. I'm like, huh? And then you have to do the classic thing where you pick up a card and read it, and you're like, oh, that's good to know. But yeah, paying attention to detail, knowing exactly what every card does, but just more than that, understanding when any given card could come into play. Like you have counterplays in your deck, maybe. Like, okay, maybe if I could, like here, like if you have a counterplay in your deck, what can this card do? What are you looking for this card to do? Normally, counterplays nowadays are used for floodgates, right? But you know, in certain matchups, you might be like, oh well, this card will hit something specific. So yeah, you have to understand, kind of like the curve, you have to understand when cards are able to be the best. Next up, we have knowledge. Once again, I've already mentioned this a couple times. Knowing what cards exist is important, not only for deck building, for you to know what cards to put in your deck, but for playing as well, because you have to know what cards you might be going up against, especially when you consider cards like counterplays. And yeah, again, not only for your own deck, but just knowing the general card pool of a meta can only work in your benefit, right? Because if you know what cards exist in the meta and you know what cards people are playing in general, you will be prepared to use your cards to the best ability that they can be used. Like again, counterplays. If you know exactly where to stop your opponent, a lot of decks. So a lot of decks. I'll just bring up this example. A lot of decks nowadays don't have very small cards, right? So you play a card like this Gohan Floodgate, you play it, activate it, your opponent can't swing unless they bottom deck a battle card 2 or less. And then you know that their deck plays very little cards that fulfill a cost. Let's say one of the most popular deck right now, Green Gohan. They barely have any cards that they could bottom deck for this. This is almost like a full stop against that deck. But some people will play like a 1-drop like the Krillin. So from there on, I can, they might try to play it so that they can swing with something, and I just, hard stop them with Decisive Strike because I know that that might be a possibility. I set up Decisive Strike correctly. I put my Z Battle card in play. I make sure that I have a card to bottom deck and fulfill the requirement. So because I knew that deck had that in the deck, and somebody might have it, I'm preparing for that possibility without really hindering my own strategy. So, as we've seen, if you don't, if some people don't know, there's somebody, Michael Friend, he has been topping recently a lot with very, I guess, to the populace, weird decks. He's been picking up Goku GT, Gogeta not GT, Gogeta BR, and most recently Schumann Salsa set 12. And he's been doing really well with them. He's been getting very good results. And you look at his builds, and they are very prepared for what the meta was. You look at the most recent one, Sherman Salsa, for example. that deck was awesome. It was extremely prepared to go against like Gohan because of the super combo loop. They played the red Vegeta, recycled Gogeta. His deck had cards in it that would go against that strategy. Basically, the leader itself warps battle cards from the drop. Oh, well, a nice super combo. Then he would play Broly, I believe Omen of Evolution. Kills the super combo in the combo step. So obviously what he would do is, opponent swings or whatever, they super combo, draw a card, and then he would combo Broly, pop the super combo, and then warp it with the leader effect. It's a very, very neat combo that works when you have good knowledge of the card pool. You have good knowledge of the meta, and you have a plan for it. Now that would he still topped, right? So he had plans against other decks, but that goes to show how much rewards you get from knowing things, basically. Spending time looking at leaders, looking at the meta, looking at lists of topped is very worth doing for events if your goal is to top or place high or just whatever personal goal you have, if it's to just improve even. Also, there are we know that there are some players that just play one thing, right? Back in the day, Legends used to just play Invoker. There's always some sort of player that will only play one thing and stay committed to it. And those people generally tend to be top players, right? So something that is to be said is that if you want to top an event, you might want to look into those and prepare a strategy for those. Not super heavily, because it isn't the only person doing it, but that is one thing. If you are expecting to perform well, you should prepare to come across those people at the top. And then, again, just in general, just at least knowing the meta of the format, it's going to push you forward. Again, I recommend going to Eggman events if you didn't watch the last video. I mentioned that website made by Eggman. He just puts all the results of the events, I believe, from all regions as well. So you can just go in there, look at the lists, and get yourself, starting to get acquainted with the meta. Next up, I'm going to be talking about a couple topics that really deserve their own video, but since they are related to playing, I do want to hit on them just so that they are in the video of all basics, right? First is sequencing. This is a very important aspect of the game, both offensively and defensively. Sequencing is extremely important, which is obviously why I want to make a shorter separate video on it. And especially like this deck, Gohan, specifically, is very extremely sequence intensive. This is why I believe that this deck hasn't shown up very much, and not many people have played it. You look at who I can't remember the name of the guy that topped in Tennessee that got second place. But he played this deck, and when you look at him, you saw him play on stream. His sequencing with this deck, obviously because he knows the deck, but his sequencing with this deck was extremely clean. Also in Madison, Jeremy Chestnut, I was judging the event, so I was walking around, watching them play, and his sequencing and these builds are also very good, but his sequencing was very clean, and it has to be when you play this leader, because basically on the back you're basically playing with extremely few cards in hand, so you have to know what your possibilities are very well. You have to know what you might be able to draw into. You have to know a lot of things to be able to play this deck to its maximum potential. So this deck is like the epitome of sequencing, in my opinion, especially because it's also aggressive. But it just sequencing matters in general because what you do changes a lot depending on what you play against. You might be playing, you play differently into blue than you do against green, obviously, or any of the 5 colors. And you might even play differently into specific decks, like, Android 21. I really hate that deck, but, it has that permanent where it can use your cards as energy, and especially for a blue or green deck, you have to be extremely careful of how you play the game. Not because it's a blue or a blue-green deck, but because it's specifically Android 21, and that, it goes for anybody, right? But for now, I'll just, I'll leave it at saying that you should be thinking about how you conduct your turnouts. Think about every move you make. Think before you do something. Think about the possibilities that your opponent might have in response to you, or in defense, think about what they might try to do offensively to, try to bait you out, do a lot of things. But yeah, just be thinking about how you play your turns out. And lastly, what I want to talk about is extending, which means, sometimes you're put in a position where you can push damage, or you have different options of defense due to your opponent not having a response, or offensively due to you again answering their floodgate with like a counterplay. This is another topic that deserves its own video, because I see a lot of people that do it wrong once in a while. I watch even at locals, some of my my friends, they'll combo to incorrect numbers, and then it costs them the game because then they don't have enough combo on their kill swing, or they overcommit and overextend, and then it costs them the game on the crackback. So what I always tell people as somebody that has played a lot of aggro in their lifetime and constantly has to think about this is, think about what happens when you pass turn. If you're stressed, nervous, you're having a lot of trouble with the decide during your turn. If you think about this line, you can form a clear idea of what you should do and how you should do it during your turn. Just think about it. Oh, you're having a tough time, like, I don't know, turn 4, you have few cards in hand, you think you might have a chance to go in, but it might be risky and you don't know what to do. You spend a lot of time thinking, you don't want to go into time, all that stuff. Just think to yourself, okay, just reset, take a deep breath, relax, and think, okay, what happens if I pass turn? Can I defend? What will my opponent have? Can I, even if I take the risk and I don't get it, am I gonna cripple them? Or if they have an answer, am I completely dead? There's a lot of paths to go down and think about, which is why I want to talk about this in a different sort of video. But just mostly think about what happens if you pass turn, because this is also really important for aggro, because aggro decks normally try to thread the line of defense and extreme offense, right? You go very, very hard, but nowadays a lot of decks can clap back. So you have to think about when to stop and when to keep energy up for defense and stuff like that. So I've always thought about that, and I always tell people about that now for whatever deck they play. It applies to absolutely everything, because I see people make mistakes all the time. My dad has this issue sometimes where he doesn't know where to go. And normally it works out for him because he plays like extreme control, right? So he doesn't ever have to go in until he's guaranteed to kill you. But in general, I see a lot of people making mistakes with especially control and hand destruction decks, where they are not making the correct decisions at the correct times. You don't know when to go in. You don't know when to start pushing a little bit of damage because your opponent will take it. Especially hand destruction. A lot of people like to discard to 0 and only hit it with crits and stuff like that. That's not how you play hand destruction. But I can, again, I can talk about that in a different time. And again, extending applies to the combo step. See a lot of people, again, just going to incorrect numbers and in custom games, all that stuff. Again, there's a lot of little details to consider when you think about extending your plays. Again, which is why it will be a separate topic, but just like sequencing, I wanted to touch on it sufficiently so that I can, cover the basics of it. So, overall, again, I think playing is obviously the way to get a higher placing, right? You have to be able to play well. But again, it's the least important, or not the least important, but the easiest of the 3 big aspects I go over when considering the basics of improving. Again, deck building, playing, and testing. Playing will come as second nature if you put the correct time into building decks and testing them correctly, with the right mentality and the right sort of outlook, and contacting the correct people if you need to, right? But obviously not everybody works the same way. This is just my opinion. This is the way that I think things are done the most efficiently. So, as always, take the approach that you think will fit you best. Obviously, that's going to be better than whatever I recommend to you. I'm just, I'm trying to create a good baseline. With that being said, this one's a little shorter, right? This is the end for video 2 of this series. Hopefully this was useful information for you who watched. If you have any questions, always feel free to leave a comment. If you know me on Facebook, please feel free to add me, message me. I'm always open to messages. I get people messaging me, oh, sorry to bother. It's my pleasure. I'm a judge. I love helping people. This is why I'm doing this series. So if you have any question at all, even if you think it's stupid, please reach out, leave a comment, and I will do my best to answer your question, okay? Please consider supporting the channel if you enjoyed the video, and I will see you guys on the next one. Peace. Take care, guys.